everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Can Nonprofit Marketing and Communications Advance Equity? My name is Christina Gaugury-Campbell, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications at Independent Sector, a diverse community of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people in the United States thrive. This webinar is brought to you by Independent Sector and Prosper Strategies, the leading marketing and communications consultancy for the nonprofit sector. I'm joined here today by our moderator, Alyssa Conrardy, President of Prosper Strategies, and a special guest, Dorri McWhorter, CEO of YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago.
Hi, Dorri and Alyssa. YWCA, actually. Sorry to interrupt you there, Christina.
YWCA. I so apologize about that.
It's free the first time. We'll let this one go. Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for that introduction. Happy to be here with all of you today.
Great. So many of you have joined us for earlier webinars in this series. This is the 10th in the 13-part series Prosper Strategies has put together for us, focused on concepts in their nonprofit marketing manifesto, which lays out 10 commitments nonprofits must make to increase their mission impact through marketing. Last December's webinar is where we introduced the manifesto as a whole, and then each month since we've covered one of the other commitments. This month's focus is commitment number 9, which is all about avoiding poverty and stereotype porn, preventing doing harm to our stakeholders in the marketing and communications realm, and in the ideal world, using marketing and communications as a tool to advance equity. We'll send around a recording and slides after today's session, so don't worry about taking notes. And so we can't wait to get this started. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you, Dorri, for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, as always, we're excited to be here with all of you today on yet another webinar, our second one this month. So you've been seeing a lot of us lately, and thank you for joining again if you were on that last webinar or any previous webinars in our series. Before we dive in, as always, I would like to take just a moment to help you all orient yourselves in GoToWebinar and greet some of you on the line. So please go ahead and find the questions box within the GoToWebinar platform and type in your name, your organization name, your title, and where you're calling in from. And I'll give you just a moment to find that. You can find the questions box on the right side of your screen. So I'll welcome some of you as you join here. And don't worry, if I don't say your name, it doesn't mean we don't see you. There are a lot of you, already over 100 on the line. So first off, I'd like to welcome Shira from Promo, Missouri, Communications Manager. Mark from Cara, Chicago, Marcom's manager. Mark was at one of our events earlier this week. Good to see you, or last week, I guess that was. Good to see you again, Mark. We have Pam Chapman with the Fairview Foundation Fund, grants manager in St. Paul. Victoria from Grow and Lead, associate in Marquette, Michigan. Lisa with Pacific House in Sanford, Connecticut. It's an emergency men's homeless shelter. Patricia from Middleton Outreach Ministry, development director. Christy from Clearfield, Utah, Davis County Health Department Senior Services. Jennifer Collins, marketing manager with Resource Center in Dallas, Texas. Liz from Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission, director of advancement. Christine from Elks Foundation in Chicago, our neighbor. Great to see all of you, and for so many of you who I missed and wasn't able to read off, know that we see you, we know you're here. If your questions pop up in the questions box throughout, we will be seeing those. We'll keep track of your questions throughout today's webinar and circle back to as many of them as we can, whether they're for me or for Dorri or for both of us at the end of today's webinar. So keep using my questions box. As Christina mentioned, I'm Alyssa Conrardy, President of Prosper Strategies. Some of you know me from past webinars or events. For those of you who aren't yet familiar with me or with Prosper, we are a Chicago-based marketing firm that works exclusively with nonprofits on marketing and brand strategy and implementation. And through that work, we have a lot of conversations with our clients and people in the sector at large about the importance of equity and inclusion, and kind of tangential to that, the challenges around fairly and accurately representing our stakeholders in marketing and communications while still garnering support from donors and funders. So this is a really huge topic, an important one that we believe needs to be discussed and explored more. So can't wait to have this conversation today and hear more from Dorri, who I think is a real forward thinker and thought partner in this area. So, Dorri, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience if they don't know you?
Happy to. So, as Alyssa said, I'm Dorri McWhorter, the CEO of the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago, and I've been in the role for about 6 years. And by background, I'm a CPA and have been a partner in a management consulting and accounting firm prior to joining the YWCA, but spent all of my career in the private sector. And so while this is my first stint as a leader in the nonprofit space, I've been very active on nonprofit boards prior to this as well. So just have such an appreciation for not only what we do at the YWCA, but quite frankly, the great challenges that I believe nonprofits have to address in trying to do the business of doing good. So thank you, Alyssa, and Prosperous Strategies, I have to say, for the Nonprofit Marketing Manifesto. I think it's beautifully done.
Well, thank you.
And I'm glad that we get the opportunity to talk about at least one of those commitments today. So thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Yeah, and the panel that Dorri spoke on with Prosperous Strategies a couple of months ago, this topic came up, and we both got really excited about digging into it deeper. So I'm happy we have a chance to continue that conversation here today and involve some of you in it. Here's our agenda on this next screen for today's webinar. We will start with an introduction to our focus commitment this month, commitment number 9, and then we'll transition to the part of the webinar that you're all probably most excited for, the Q&A with Dorri, and wrap up by taking some of the questions that you all have for her and for me on the same topic. We'll also, as always, have a preview of the next webinar, which is coming up in October. So stay tuned for that, as well as some other resources. And as Christina mentioned, you will receive a recording and a link to these slides. So don't worry about taking copious notes as we go through today's content. Ready to dive in, Dorri?
Sure.
All right. So, as you know, we're here to discuss commitment number 9 from the Nonprofit Marketing Manifesto, which says we will avoid at all costs sacrificing the dignity of those we serve for the sake of our marketing and communications goals. This commitment goes on to say that we will recognize that our marketing efforts are not a success if they marginalize, stereotype, or otherwise in any way disempower the people we serve, no matter how well they perform by other metrics. And in this case, at least for the purpose of today's conversation, I would extend marketing to also include communications and fundraising in this commitment. So our marketing, communications, and fundraising efforts are not a success if they marginalize, stereotype, or disempower the people we hope to serve. What we really had in mind when we wrote this commitment was the problematic practice that's long been commonplace in the nonprofit sector of poverty porn, or known more broadly as stereotype porn. And even if you're not familiar with these terms, poverty porn and stereotype porn, you have likely seen examples of these practices everywhere in ads and marketing collateral from, not to call out too many names, but organizations in the past like UNICEF, or shown here, Concern Worldwide, UK Aid. Let's take a look at an example from a TV ad from Concern Worldwide, which actually won Radiaid's Rusty Radiator Award for, it's not an award you want to win, the worst in poverty porn a few years ago. Let's take a look at this for a moment.
How do you tell Alyssa that no one's coming to save her life? That no one's coming to give her the food she needs to survive? This little girl is wasting away. The food at home is running out. Alyssa could die waiting for the help that didn't come. Hungry, sick children are dying right now because, yet again, there's no food to go around. But it doesn't have to be like this. We can stop the hunger. Concern Worldwide is doing all we can to get to starving children in some of the remotest parts of the world. We've saved thousands of young lives. Please go online and give just £3 a month so we can reach more starving children. Your support is vital. You can provide emergency food that saves lives and fills painful, empty tummies, and make sure children are kept healthy. You can transform families' lives, helping them grow enough food so they don't keep facing the threat of hunger. Please go online and give just £3 a month. Help free children from a life of hunger. If no one comes to help children like Alyssa, they won't survive. Thank you.
Okay, so it's pretty hard to watch, I think. As you can see, this ad really promotes every stereotype possible about malnutrition, poverty in Africa, hunger, sort of this white savior complex, all of these stereotypes, and tries to encourage giving out of guilt and out of really showing some of the most heart-wrenching and in some cases extremely stereotypical images of this crisis possible. So this is an extreme example. I think that goes without saying. And these sorts of extreme examples are found most often in the international aid community. But the truth is, and something I think we need to really open up the conversation about, this sort of thing happens all the time, not always on such extreme and obvious levels, and not just in the international aid community, but here domestically among organizations that work in the U.S. as well. Really in all areas of the nonprofit sector in big and small ways, stereotype porn and poverty porn are truly present everywhere. And there's even examples of these things happening in organizations that are extremely well-meaning that you would not suspect, right? So I think we need to unpack that a little bit. And I want to start by getting clear about how we define stereotype porn. So the definition that we'd like to propose for the purpose of today's webinar is we define stereotype porn as any type of communications, be it written, photographed, or filmed, that exploits the condition of a group that experiences disadvantages in order to generate necessary sympathy for increasing support and charitable donations for a cause. So with that working definition in mind, let's kind of open up this conversation. We really believe at Prosper Strategies that stereotype porn and all its kind of close cousins and poverty porn and all the various ways this shows up are far more harmful than helpful. And when we wrote our manifesto last year, we really wanted to encourage organizations to recognize this practice, even when it's happening in more subtle, less obvious or overt ways, and find better, more equitable ways to garner support from donors. Because the case that often gets made for stereotype porn and poverty porn is we need to pull at a donor's heartstrings. And if we don't show them the problem, how will they know how much help is needed? Someone else will capture their attention with that really startling imagery and those sorts of messages. That's the case in favor of it, but there are so many cases to be made against it and so many better ways to achieve the same aim. So if your organization is guilty of communicating in a way that even more subtly than that example I just showed, but in any way exploits or harms the people that you hope to help, the time to change your approach absolutely is now. So if you think this might be you, there are a few steps that we suggest for kind of checking yourself and evolving your approach. So first off, if you expect that your organization might have some problems in this area, but maybe they aren't quite so obvious, we suggest just taking some time to audit your existing communications, really all touch points, from your website to the appeal letters you send to donors, and identifying areas where you suspect you may be unfairly or inaccurately representing the conditions of the groups or communities that you work with and that you hope to serve. I'm sure that your organization has really good intent, but don't let that bias your audit as you go through and see are there areas where you need to check yourself on that. Try to see your communications and marketing through the eyes of the individuals and communities represented within them. And say, if this was me, how would I feel about being represented this way in this letter to our donors? Not what will our donors think, but how will the people we're talking about in these examples feel about the way that we're sharing their stories and images of their situations. And then, because it's impossible not to bring at least some of your own biases into this work, we really suggest that you gather a focus group to facilitate one-on-one interviews with a representative sample, as representative as it can be, of the individuals, groups, or communities that you're portraying in your marketing and communications. And just ask them to point out areas where they feel accurately and fairly represented in your marketing communications, and areas where they feel stereotyped, disempowered, or exploited on the extreme end of the spectrum, or on the less extreme end, where they just feel represented in any way that doesn't feel true to their lived experience. And through this process, it's so important to explain why you're doing this work and reiterate your intentions to ensure accurate representation for your stakeholders that does feel true to their lived experiences. That you're involving them because you want to improve, that you know you're not perfect, that you anticipate mistakes, and that you really could use, help and involvement from the communities you work with in thinking about the best way to represent them and their experiences. So as you move through this, you will likely begin to see some areas where your organization could do better, even if you are nowhere near that extreme example that I just shared, and I'm sure most of you are not. There will likely be areas where you can improve. So the next step is making a commitment to evolve your communications accordingly and providing a clear timeline for that evolution. Particularly, it's important to provide that sort of clarity about what you'll do with this information and what you find to people who participated in any focus groups or interviews to inform the work. You need to keep them posted on the outcomes of that work, and that it's not just about conversation, it's about taking action and mapping out what you'll do to create change. And while change can't always happen overnight, communicating your intent and being really transparent about the progress that you're making and the work still left to be done is really critical. And then as you begin to develop new messages or campaigns based on what you're learning, it's so important to continue to get stakeholder feedback. This isn't a one and done process. I think there will be a constant process within our organizations and within the sector of learning and evolution. So the people your organization serves should still take priority here as you aim to continually evolve and improve. You might want to continue to ask them questions about how they feel about the things that you're putting out into the world with the learnings that you had from those initial focus groups and the improvements that you're trying to make. But as this starts to roll out into the real world, you may also at this point want to get feedback from your donors, your funders, and others sort of in your ecosystem to see how your new approach resonates with them and educate them about shifts you're making in the way that you communicate and sort of the larger underlying reason for those shifts. Ideally, you should aim to involve the people you serve that your organization works with day in and day out in telling their own stories through their own quotes and their own language, and then continually check back with them to make sure that that representation feels accurate and true to them. And then second priority is to see how your donors and funders and others outside of those groups react. And then finally, as you work to evolve your communications away from stereotype porn and toward a more complete picture of the individuals and communities that your organization works with, just know that you might face detractors. There might be people on your staff or your board who fear that your new approach fails to, kind of like I said before, pull at donor heartstrings. And you may even realistically see a short-term decline in donations or other sorts of support, depending on the makeup of your donor base and how big of a shift you're making, how used to the old ways of communicating folks were. But ultimately, we believe that the net result of moving away from stereotype and poverty porn is always going to be a positive one. So that's why the fifth and final tip I'll offer in this process, which admittedly is very high level for a very complex process, is just to stay the course and commit to doing what's right for your stakeholders in your marketing and communications. It's sometimes a long process and one that will be painful on multiple different levels. You can't even anticipate necessarily all of the detractors that you might run into along the way and challenges that you might face, but ultimately just know that it's the right thing to do and stay the course. So I'd also like to suggest a couple of useful tools here for those who are committed to doing this work. And we will put links to both of these in the follow-up email with the webinar recording. They're also within the chat box and GoToWebinar if you want to grab these links. First resource is a progressive style guide, and that's a really important piece published by Hannah Thomas from someofus.org and Anna Hirsch from activisteditor.net, kind of two of the leading thinkers in this space. And the goal of this guide is really to help people who care harness language in support of intersectionality and cross-sector power building. That's how they describe it. The guide provides ideas for combating discriminatory language, seeking stakeholder participation, and reflecting a broad range of identities and perspectives in your communications. It covers issue areas ranging from disability to immigration to gender identity, and then in each of those issue areas offers suggested or preferred language in each. So don't say this, say this, is kind of how that guide is structured. And then the second resource that I will mention here is the Frameworks Institute. Frameworks Institute is a nonprofit think tank that produces a whole array of resources that aim to advance the nonprofit sector's capacity to frame the public discourse about social and scientific issues. The organization has a signature approach that's called the Strategic Framework Analysis, and that approach offers empirical guidance based on a whole bunch of data that they've gathered over many, many years on what to say, how to say it, and what to leave unsaid when you're communicating about social issues and about various different groups and populations. So again, both resources are linked in the chat and will be in your follow-up email. Take a look at both. They've both been hugely formative in the work that we do here at Prosper Strategies with our clients and just on our own team. So far, as we've gone through this topic, we have really only been talking about moving away from stereotype and poverty porn, which at its heart is a do no harm approach. But since we published our manifesto last December, we've really come to realize that our conversation needs to be bigger than just do no harm. We feel at our core that nonprofit marketing and communications can do more than avoid harm. They truly can do good. So at the panel that Dorri was on with us a few months ago that I mentioned earlier, we started to discuss this idea that marketing and communications can be used as tools to advance our organization's goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is an emerging idea, I think, that really excites us both. So that's where I want to take our conversation here today. And just a little bit of additional context on this as it applies to YWCA. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion are clearly really important topics in the nonprofit sector and in the world right now. Realize that there are really almost as many definitions for these words as there are organizations on the line today. So before we dive into the Q&A with Dorri, I'd like to share a couple of examples of how YWCA is defining each term on a national level, and then show some examples of how the organization is advancing its goals in that area or starting to scratch the surface of that using marketing and communications based on the ways that they're defining those terms. So what you're seeing up here on the screen now is a piece that was published in 2016 by YWCA on a national level. It's their social justice glossary. And this glossary defines terms like power, diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that the organization was at the time of publication really comfortable with saying these are shared definitions that we can work with and work around as we shape this work. So let's start by looking at how YWCA defines diversity on a national level, and then look at how that definition and the goals around it play out from the perspective of marketing and communications and kind of related tactics. So on a national level, within this glossary, YWCA says that diversity can mean a variety of things. That's the first sentence in the definition, which is true, right? It may sound vague, but it's really true. They say that diversity focuses on emphasizing how many of these we have in a room or an organization or any setting, meaning, for example, how many non-binary people, how many people of color, how many people experiencing homelessness, the list could go on and on. And this definition cautions that it is possible to name, acknowledge, and celebrate diverse culture without really truly doing anything to transform the systems that produce and maintain racial injustices, which we absolutely agree with here at Prosper. This is a really great way to think about the limitations as well as the possibilities surrounding the term and the concept of diversity. So it's clear from this glossary and definition that YWCA's goal on a national level is to advance diversity, both internally and externally, in the spaces where the organization works, while at the same time motivating people to think bigger than just diversity, saying clearly this is just part of where this conversation needs to go. So their approach to marketing and communications is making, I'm sure, many, many moves to advance that goal. But just one example from the outside that I was able to pick up on is what you're seeing here. Screenshot of a blog written by Lily Eisner about the fact that diversity, particularly racial diversity, only scratches the surface when it comes to addressing today's many social justice challenges. This is a piece of thought leadership published on their website, and by publishing articles like this as part of YWCA's national thought leadership strategy, which ultimately is probably part of what they see as their marketing and communication strategy, the organization is really taking a stand around diversity and its limitations, right? And asking others to come along with them. So that's the diversity side of the equation, just one of, I'm sure, many, many examples that exist. Let's take a look now at how YWCA describes inclusion on a national level. So from this glossary, they say that it is an intentional effort to transform the status quo by creating opportunities for those who have been historically marginalized. And they also emphasize that focusing on inclusion is a way to combat the idea that simply adding diversity will foster equity and access and opportunity. So they suggest beginning with the wants of the historically marginalized population rather than the historically privileged when we think about inclusion. So how is YWCA's marketing and communications advancing the organization's goals around inclusion? Great example of this is actually out of Chicago, and that's Y Shop, an initiative started by Dorri and her team in Chicago in 2015. Is that right,
Yes,
Dorri?
it is.
And this is really at its heart a perfect example of inclusive cause marketing. So we'll get into this more in the Q&A with Dorri, but Y Shop is an online store managed by YWCA Metropolitan Chicago that offers a curated selection of goods and services where a portion of each purchase goes to benefit the organization and the communities that they support. So while Y Shop was initially conceived, I think, as a way to build out a new revenue stream for the organization, Dorri and her team really quickly, probably simultaneously, realized that it could also help them advance their inclusion goals because Y Shop was so clearly a way to create space and opportunity for people of color and others from historically marginalized groups, women who might not have as easy of access as others to channels through which to sell their products or market their businesses. So while it's not necessarily giving preference to those groups, it's creating space, creating a seat at the table. And Y Shop brings in earned revenue for YWCA, but it also gives historically marginalized business owners new opportunity. So more to dive into, I'm sure, there later. It's a really exciting initiative and one that I think we can learn a lot from. Finally, though, let's look at how YWCA thinks about equity. So the organization from this glossary says that equity is about treating everyone fairly by considering the structural factors that benefit some groups or communities and harm others. They emphasize that sometimes justice demands for the purpose of equity an unequal response. So unpacking that a little bit more, let's contrast that with the concept of equality, which according to this glossary, YWCA defines as a focus on treating everyone the same. And this glossary cautions against the equality approach. They explain that equality, having an emphasis on equality, often ignores the historical structural factors that benefit some social groups and communities and harm others. And often the glossary goes on to say that as a response to racism, people will often claim to have a colorblind orientation or seek to create colorblind policies that treat all people equally. But the glossary goes on to say that colorblindness often leads to inequity because it doesn't acknowledge the historical and contemporary, still happening today, systemic forces of oppression that do not allow all of us to be ourselves fully equally. Right? So a lot to unpack there. So how is YWCA's marketing and communications advancing equity? Again, I'm sure there are countless examples, but here's just one. So earlier this summer, in response to rally cries and tweets, calling for elected women of color to go back home, YWCA joined forces with Vote, Run, Lead, Ignite, and the United States of Women to issue a joint statement about their commitment to increasing the participation of women and girls, especially women of color and immigrant women, in decision-making at all levels of government in the U.S. And the organization then used its marketing channels, such as their Facebook page, to spread the word about this commitment and encourage others to join them in the fight to reduce barriers to participation by women, especially, again, women of color and immigrant women in government. So with an equality approach, YWCA would have made a statement that all people deserve an equal chance at office, or maybe even women, but the organization went a step further with their equity focus, emphasizing the need to give priority access to women of color and immigrant women in their statement. And they really made that stance known through marketing. They didn't sort of come at it subtly or sneak it in as a final sentence. It was their full stance as part of the statement and the marketing messaging around it. These are, of course, just some of the many examples I'm sure that exist of ways YWCA is using marketing to advance its diversity, equity, and inclusion goals on the national level and here in Chicago. But I hope that they're inspiring to you as you think about not just avoiding poverty porn and stereotype porn, but this bigger, broader role that marketing and communications can play in helping us all advance the really important goals that our organizations have in these areas. So, Dorri, I know you have more to share with us. We'll get to your questions here, questions that we have for you in just a moment. Dorri, I'm sure, also has a lot of thoughts about how her organization here in Chicago can continue to explore leveraging Marcom and fundraising for these aims. And since this is really a new concept for YWCA and most organizations, we're just excited to have a very open and candid conversation about this. So with that said, let's transition to Q&A. All right, Dorri, back on the podium here, the virtual podium. Thank you again. In an interview with Crain's Chicago Business a few years ago, you noted that one of the first changes that you initiated when you took over YWCA in 2013 was swapping out poverty porn-like images of unsmiling YWCA clients in your organization's marketing materials and replacing them with more happy, more hopeful appearing clients. So can you tell us more about where poverty porn or stereotype porn were showing up in YWCA's marketing materials and sort of the harm you felt that was causing, and then what you did about it?
Absolutely. And again, thank you for all the background material you shared, because I do think that that was all very helpful, and not only the framing of the conversation, but really some great ideas and thoughts about what we could do to address this. So when I joined, it was interesting. When I looked around, I said, clearly our services aren't working because everyone still looks miserable, right? And so that was just a natural reaction to what I saw. But then even more than that, the representation of people of color, we were over-indexing on. And so I was also mindful as we talk about perpetrating certain stereotypes, I was very concerned that we would have angry Black women consistently displayed in all of our marketing material as well. So for me, it was multiple factors that made us want to. And fortunately, I have a leader of our team who also saw the need to address this and hadn't been in that position prior. And so, but for us, it was absolutely focused on how do we represent what our clients truly are experiencing, and how do we send different messages to the marketplace, as you and I like to talk about. How do we shape the conversation and the narrative around what images people see out there and what communications they receive can truly help change the very systems and institutions we're trying to change as well. So we did take that approach, and we're very thoughtful and intentional around that. It wasn't enough for us to only update the pictures, but also the language we were seeing people use in relationship to our clients, and actually, quite frankly, having to correct some donors. We had one donor that we would have them participate in one of our programs for our young parents, and every single time he would create this narrative of these stories around our young ladies, and I was like, that's just not true, because he would create this narrative around they were unmarried mothers and just all these creating narratives that just weren't true, right? But, however well-intentioned, we really had to address that as well, to be able to let folks know that really wasn't acceptable. And God forbid that any of them heard him say that about them. And that's the other, so what we did, so in addition to the updating all of the photography, which, by the way, was at a cost, right? Because we did have to go through not only the photography itself, but then the reprinting of banners, brochures, all of that comes with that. So we did that, but from a communication standpoint, was absolutely very explicit with our staff that we do not say things about our clients that if they were sitting in the room that we would not say to their face. So, because the most horrible thing that I've experienced from time and time again going to certain events, you have someone describing sort of the absolute horrid conditions of someone and say, look, they're over there right in the room, please stand up. And so we avoid the dog and pony shows. We invite people to share their stories from their perspective when appropriate, but we really do. When someone calls us and say, we really like a client to come talk to us about this, why? What will you accomplish with that? What's going to happen because of that messaging? And not put people in positions that are just extremely uncomfortable and can be undignified as well as degrading, just depending on, again, how they're approaching that as well.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's great. I think that's a really great barometer for, are you edging toward what could be considered problematic or what could be defined as stereotype or poverty porn? It's test, would I be willing to say this to the face of someone we work with, and would I feel like it was true to them and their experience if I had to? So a really good check for yourself anytime you think you might be edging into this territory. Okay, so as you made changes when you came in and sort of had to do a sweep of photography, of language, things like that, did anyone on your team or your board express worry or concern that eliminating images of women who looked unhappy or downtrodden that seemed to indicate need would have a negative effect on your fundraising?
I think that we were mindful of that, right? Because we know it is that people engage with you for a number of reasons. And so we had to be mindful of who was actually engaging with us. For example, when I came in, there was this mantra when we did certain fundraising events that we needed to make them cry 3 times. Why? Why would you do that?
Right.
And we decided that we wanted people to explore the full range of their emotions as they participate in our events, and that could not be the goal.
Right.
And so what it did for us, it changed the stories that we were, or how we were telling the stories. So if we had our videographer or the person that would do the videos for us, we would talk about what did we want to highlight about that person's story. Because if they were crying, we didn't want it to be because they felt sorry for them, because they were inspired by them.
Yeah.
And so it really became part of, and continues to be part of our ethos, is that we want to present our clients in the best light possible. And, we actually, while we wanted to strike that balance, but we were hoping that we just were targeting what specific emotion we want to type into versus automatically assuming that we needed to tap into just the pure sadness and guilt emotion. And we also learned that guilt dollars, you can't keep feeling guilty for so many times.
Mm-hmm.
Like even me loving dogs, I cannot watch those. I just can't watch them, right? And so because people sort of have a capacity for guilt, but it seems like they have greater capacity for joy. So to experience ongoing joy and inspiration, I think people have greater capacity for. No one has ever said, I'm just getting too happy, right? But people do have they get full and have a capacity or limit to how much sad stuff or guilt you can make a person feel before they walk away.
Absolutely.
And so we wanted to expand their capacity relative to inspiration and joy, and having that emotion being experienced when they came to our events or saw us online or encountered the YWCA in a number of ways.
Great. Yeah. I mean, no one's ever said I have happiness fatigue, but you definitely hear about compassion fatigue. And I think that's a real thing, especially today. There are just so many heavy things to deal with in our world. And yes, it can be compelling here and there to see problems that we face in our communities, but we have a limited capacity to take those messages in, to digest them, and to feel like we can do something about it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's so important, because the action part of that, right? What action can you take? Because if you felt like you've given enough or you've done enough and it still hasn't changed and things are still bad, at some point you're like, well, you know what? I can't help you anymore.
Throw my hands up.
So we have to say, hey, this is helping us, and you're part of the journey, and you're part of improving this, and until we're done, we're not done.
Right.
But if it's always like, this is broken, you're going to contribute, it's still broken, you're going to contribute, it's still broken, people are going to be like, yeah, well, I'm good.
Yeah, exactly.
It clearly isn't working.
I love that, and I think it's a refreshing approach, and clearly one that's working well, because your organization's experienced some really great growth and progress over the years that you've been in leadership. Okay, so tell us a little bit about how you engage your clients and the communities that YWCA works with here in the Chicago area in providing input into or making decisions around the way that they're represented in your marketing, in your communications, in your fundraising. And are there areas where you think you can grow there too, where there's more that could be done?
Absolutely, because I think we probably err on the side of not including our clients too much, because right, wrong, or indifferent, I've developed this protectionist type of approach to them. Like, why? What do you want to hear from them? What do you want to, what do you want from their involvement, right, when we get those requests? But having said that, when we do have our clients there, we're asking them to take us through their journey with them. So we don't coach them. We don't script them. So what we do is let them authentically express what it is that they've experienced with us and leave it at that. And I think that's so important, because, we're not trying to shape a message through them. Right. So however they choose to show up is what we get. And I think that authentic representation of who they are is most important, because there are times when we're like, we wish she had told this about her story, but she didn't. But who would we be to coach her on how to tell her story?
We can't put those words in her mouth.
We will not put those words in her mouth, even though from our perspective, what she did was so compelling. So we were actually trying to celebrate more with her in this one particular case, but she didn't want to talk about that. So partially because some of the evidence of what she experienced was very evident just in her physical appearance.
Sure.
So why should she have to talk about that,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And she may not have felt like it at the time. So we really honor the person in the process. And I just think that if we stay true to that, then we can't go wrong. And however that shows up. So even if we believe that this would be so aligned with the specific message that we want to convey, if they choose not to participate in that way with us, that's good.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings is an African proverb, and I can say that because I was there when that particular person said it on behalf of a country in Africa. And what he said was that which is done for us and not with us is done to us. And I feel like in our effort to help people, we can't do things to them. We have to let them be a part of that experience with us, and whether that experience is communications or marketing or fundraising, that they have to be with us and a partner with us, and particularly if we're going to leverage their story to do any of that.
100%.
That's why I so appreciate your manifesto and the commitment, because I was like, geez, hit that right on. Spot on.
Well, and it's something that we all stand to learn on and evolve on, but I think starting with letting people tell their own stories and not forcing a narrative on anyone. Mm-hmm. Your story can really only be told by you. And remembering that is true to each of you, every individual on this webinar, every individual in the world, and it's true of every person that we work with. We need to shape our communications accordingly, even if it means our story ends up 10% less compelling than it could have been. If it is shaped by the person who experienced it, it's a win.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you are in the CEO role at the organization, and I'm sure we have other CEOs on the line today, as well as marketing leaders who are trying to sort of champion change in this area. Do you have advice for people in your role or in a marketing or comms leadership role who come into an organization, maybe they're new, it's their first year or two, or they just have kind of realized there's a new way of doing things and they want to do away with stereotype porn or poverty porn or just, even more subtle versions of this? What would you advise them to do, and anything you wish you'd done differently?
Sure. So, as I like to say, I don't often give advice, but I'll offer perspective, and people do what they may. But part of it for me is that it's an evolution, right? You have to recognize who your donors are, and not only who your donors are, but where is your organization in this journey, right? For us, we were explicit that we want to be a social enterprise. Mm-hmm. And if we want to be a social enterprise, what did it mean that we would have to do to shape our strategies relative to fundraising and marketing communications to support that? And so because we were heavily saying we don't want to be considered a charity, therefore we weren't going to do things in alignment with strategies that typical charities would engage with, which in some cases, the very notion of even using the word charity means that you're giving to people that are lesser than. Yeah. Therefore, the use of stereotype porn might actually work for your strategy. Mm-hmm. It just didn't work for us. Mm-hmm. Because if we're a social enterprise, it means that we are providing value to the marketplace. Therefore, everything that we do has to be in alignment with that messaging. And so we think that we can bring values to donors that want to improve the world. Therefore, we need to engage with them in a different way. So to me, it's going to be that combination of who are your donors and what are you trying to do from an organization perspective, and let your strategies follow that. I can't necessarily offhand think of a reason that stereotype porn is ever appropriate for an organization, but if your donors are only in the mindset that charity makes them move in their orientation to your work is that they are helping people lesser than, maybe, right? Mm-hmm. But if not, or if you're in the position where you can actually change that conversation and move the needle on that to actually create greater impact depending on your mission, you have the responsibility then to do that.
Yes, yeah, totally agree. It's on you. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, doing away with stereotype or poverty porn is only the start, and I want to move this conversation on to where we kind of got to at the end of my examples there from YWCA on a national level, on to how we can not only use marketing and communications to do no harm, but how they can be leveraged to do more good, advance our goals around DEI. So in that vein, just want to ask you first whether you feel that marketing and communications are, in fact, valuable tools for advancing your organization's goals in those areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To me, it's a fundamental tool, right? Mm-hmm. So when you take, first of all, you can see what communication strategies have done to our country. Yeah. Period. Regardless of what you cannot agree that it's an effective tactic.
Yeah.
First of all. So if you believe that, what can you do if you want to shape it to do good in the world? Right?
What's the flip side?
What's the flip side?
Yeah.
So we know it's a powerful tactic. So the question is that I do think that it needs to be an intentional tactic. And we see that what intentionality can do around that tactic. So when you actually said that, when we were together last, it blew my mind, because in this work, what I've discovered, or what I've become more committed to, is that we need to leverage every tool available. Yeah. So it may not look like direct service, but the functional areas that we focus on. So for us, we've talked about finance as a tool for social change, and I absolutely am committed to and believe that communications and marketing can be a tool for social change. First of all, marketing is created in itself to bring people to action, right, to create movement and behavioral changes in people, to make them not want to buy a piece of candy to all of a sudden want a candy bar, right? That's the whole point. And so if that is part of the point, then what can we do to be very deliberate and thoughtful around how we use marketing communication as a strategy to advance the goals of equity and inclusion?
Right.
And I just think that we need to stop treating it as a side function.
Yeah.
And actually as a tool for change. And when you do, I think it's going to create different strategies for us. And for example, I was last week I was in San Francisco attending the Women's Funding Network conference, and a professor was there speaking about just how we rewrite and change our language and using nuances in words. Like, for example, the one example she gave was saying in the press you see that Jeffrey Epstein had sex with underage girls versus Jeffrey Epstein raped girls, yep, right? And I think that's the power of communications. And so if we can think about what does that message look like relative to how we are communicating the outcomes of our work, yeah, the stories that we tell about our clients, and being very explicit about that and choosing the right words and just being thoughtful about those processes, that we can start to move the needle in the places where we want to see change happen as well.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, and for any of you who face sort of the pushback on wanting to invest more intentionally around marketing and communications, and you might get pushback, well, that's overhead, or we need to save that money for direct services. I think pointing to Dorri's example of the power of communications just in our country and how communications has shaped narratives and driven change for good or for bad, that makes the case right there that absolutely communications is a powerful tool. It's not overhead. It's more than a nice to have. It's essential to advancing our missions. And if it can be used for, in some cases, evil, it can also be used for good on the flip side. Okay, so let's see. I know you've been thinking a lot about this topic lately. How could you not, right? And it sounds like you're thinking about the relationship between marketing and DEI is evolving. So how might that impact your strategy as an organization going forward? It's okay if you don't have all the answers to this, but the way you structure things at YWCA Metropolitan Chicago from a marketing, communications, fundraising function perspective, and the roles those functions play at the organization.
Sure. Well, we think about this a lot. First of all, our mission is eliminate racism and empower women. So we have a tough bill to sort of carry out in the first place. So that makes me extremely open to all of the tools available to us in the marketplace, including marketing and communications. So we've actually taken this on very seriously because, first of all, some would challenge us on how do we, as YWCA Chicago, truly activate along our Eliminate Racism part of our mission. And so because they see what we're doing on the direct services side relative to empowering women, so they're like, well, what are you doing to eliminate racism? We're like, have you seen the women we're empowering, first of all? And then the second thing I say, though, is that this is clearly also sort of what are they seeing in the public sphere to let them know that we are working on this issue, right, regardless of what we're doing within our organization. So one of the things that we took very seriously, so we actually created a chief equity officer role. And part of her role explicitly is to write thought leadership on this particular issue. So part of her role is a pure communication strategy play to get that messaging out there, to address those topics in different ways. So we were very deliberate about who we put in that role, and recognizing she had the capability to drive that communication part of that strategy to where we see it where we want it to go. Mm-hmm. And so that we restructured and took away some of her direct services responsibility because we think she could be more effective in helping us change the system by talking about it.
Right.
And so I got to introduce you to her first.
Yeah.
Of all. I just thought about that.
Yes.
But second of all, that is specifically part of we've outlined some of the objectives that we have as an organization, and one of our objectives is to specifically create content around this topic.
Yeah, I love the kind of trade-off you talked about, realizing that she can be more effective talking about and becoming a thought leader in that topic than directly involved in the direct services work, and then that can grow your capacity to do the direct services work.
Absolutely.
With a little bit of a shift of her time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because again, if you're asking the question, how do we create change, why would we ignore a significant part of how we operate as human beings,
right,
which is through communication.
Right. Yeah, great. Okay, so we've already talked about the social justice glossary that the organization published on a national level in 2016, shared that earlier. That will also be linked to attendees in your follow-up email. But can you tell us a little bit about how those shared definitions have informed your approach here in Chicago, if they have at all, or just how any sort of shared definitions that you might create or use at the organization have informed your approach?
Sure. So what I noticed about what the YWCA USA has done and provided us as a resource, a tool for us, is to almost, take these words and, in fact, in my opinion, have almost created sort of what I describe as a capability maturity model relative to this issue, right? So diversity has become sort of the baseline to some degree, is like how much of it we have, right? And then inclusion becomes a more advanced form that will take what we have and really create space for all of that we have. And then to me, this equity piece is what I end up sort of relabeling to some degree, sort of this full talent optimization framing of it. And so we absolutely understand, and we're clearly aligned to it because they are sister organizations, so we're clearly aligned to that. But I think what we continue to do is activate that in our local markets. And for us, because this is the perspective that we hold, it permeates every part of our business. So whether it's our own people and talent management processes, as well as how we just approach the marketplace with our services and our fundraising. So it's our ethos, because it's who we are. Our mission is eliminate racism, empower women. So you better well have some attention and focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity. But our ultimate, so people don't know this, because our logo says eliminating racism, empowering women. But it says the YWCA, our full mission is the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago, but the YWCA is committed to eliminate racism, empowering women by promoting peace, justice, dignity, and freedom for all. And so for us, that means everybody can show up however they identify. We just need to create the space to do that.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. Yeah, one thing I really like about this glossary is that I think it creates the freedom for us to move from talking about defining what these concepts mean to doing the real work to advance them.
Absolutely.
I think so much of the conversation in the sector, it's still around defining, and it makes sense because these are difficult topics to define. They mean different things to different people in different contexts, but ultimately we need to move beyond discussion and into action, and just sort of setting some parameters around how we talk and think about these topics as a starting point for the organization opens up the door to action in my mind.
For sure.
And here's a screenshot of that for anyone who is wondering what we're talking about. This is what we were referring to throughout for those definitions, and we'll send that around after. Okay, so I'm excited to talk more about YShop. I'm sure everyone's excited to hear more about it. Tell me more about kind of the idea behind the initiative and how it advances both your revenue goals as a social enterprise and your equity and inclusion goals.
Sure. So the YShop is, initially we were able to leverage the opportunity that Chicago Community Trust had they were looking to bring new funds into the sector. So essentially they said they don't want to build a better fundraising trap. They want to bring new revenue in. And so we said, well, consumer dollars are not philanthropy dollars, right? That's a different set of dollars. So we developed the YShop, as you mentioned earlier, to create new revenue streams for the organization, which we have successfully done. Since we launched YShop in 2015, our cost marketing efforts have yielded us about $500,000, which is good, because that would have meant that, for the past, 5 years or so, that we would have had a consistent $100,000 grant a year, right? we don't.
Right.
Right? And so the Y Shop has been great for that. But even more importantly, if you think about, that's a percentage of revenue that are being also earned by those small businesses. And so that are, well, those businesses, not all of them are small, but those businesses that are on Y Shop as well. So what we focus on from a merchant perspective is those businesses that align with our values and who want to eliminate racism, empower women. It also happens to be that those businesses are businesses that have owners and operators of color and women. Mm-hmm. And so what we discovered is that we're creating change using this as a platform by creating space for those other businesses that may not have access to the same channels that we even do as the YWCA. And so that's for all my accountants on the phone, so it's not unrelated business income because we actually are fulfilling our mission through the platform.
Right.
And so it allows us to provide services to these businesses, and because part of the work we do, we are a small business development center, so now it's a service we provide for them to access that channel, in addition to bringing the revenue stream in. So we can do more than one thing at a time, and this platform allows us to do that.
That is so great. I hope everyone is inspired by that example and think about how you might apply something similar at your organization. There are a lot of dollars flying around, especially around
space,
in the consumer space, and especially around
our economy is consumerism. So
so leverage
a lot of dollars
opportunity and take Dorri's financial advice that this doesn't have to be unrelated business income if it's mission aligned.
Exactly. Figure out a way. And the other piece, even on our website though, for Y Shop, the opening header when you first went into the landing page, we were so explicit to get those images of women.
Yeah.
We wanted all shapes and sizes and ethnically ambiguous as possible. Because very again, very intentional around who shops and who can contribute to the cause.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just even in subtle ways like that, creating a more inclusive space both for people to participate as merchants and as consumers.
And that's another piece too, and not directly related to it, but it triggered something when I just said that, who can contribute to the cause. When we think about who we even tell donor stories about.
Yeah.
For us, we need to show people of color that are in positions to support our cause, because it's also, we're combating issues and stereotypes around who can be donors and philanthropists even. So I just think this is such powerful work that we can do to move our cause in different ways that we need to tap into more.
Absolutely. So exciting. I get chills thinking about it. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of examples here, but are there other examples you can share with us that come to mind immediately of ways that your organization is using marketing or communications to advance DEI goals?
Well, I kind of jumped the gun on that last point.
Yeah. There's one.
Yes, because I do think the donor stories we tell, though, right? So we talked a lot initially about stereotype form relative to the client stories, but we need to show that we have Black women that are investing in our major philanthropists to our organization as well, because that's combating a lot of stereotypes around who holds wealth in this country and things like that too. So I think that if we use that lens, as you said, how do we use marketing communication to advance DEI? We should look at every aspect of what we're doing. We clearly, our client focus is huge, but it isn't our donors. It's in who works and does this work
everywhere, every level.
It's every aspect of our business where we are putting a message out there that to tell this story. And so we're extra mindful of that with our staff, like the staff pictures you see on our LinkedIn page, everything.
Yeah.
Everything.
And I think the subtle impact of each of those things when they're taken all together, because they're all touch points that build up over time, they create a really powerful message, environment, and space for this change to happen.
Absolutely. And that's our goal at the end of the day.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so where do you hope to see YWCA grow next in regards to this area, this issue, and how about the sector as a whole, too? We're at it.
Well, yeah.
Why not, right?
Well, I think that we've touched on it a couple times already, is that we need so if we just think that direct services is going to change the world, it is going to do its part.
Yeah.
But we need to leverage every tool available to us. And marketing communications, as we discussed already, is such a powerful tool. So imagine if we really wanted to yield that power for good and align it more directly with our goals. So why do we, as an organization, having a mission to eliminate racism and empower women, why would we go use marketing and communication strategies that would almost be the antithesis of that?
Right.
Why would we do that to ourselves, right? And so to me, it gives us an opportunity to align every strategic activity in our business with our mission. And that's what we tell businesses every day, right? We tell businesses that are private companies that are operating to help us advance women and eliminate racism. Look at what you're doing with your employees, right? And so if we're asking businesses to look at every aspect of their business, we have to do the same.
Yeah.
And I think the sector has to do the same. Because I was just in a fundraising conversation with another type of organization, and I said to them, I was like, we need to look at not only what we do, but how we do it. And the how we do it is just as important, but we miss that so many times because we're like, that doesn't have anything to do with the business.
Right.
And we're challenging people on that on the finance side. For example, we're asking larger foundations or people, period, to look at impact investing differently because you don't need to fund certain grants, but then, say 5% of your foundation does that, but what are you doing with the 95%, right? So it's the same thing for us. We can do direct service, but how are we looking at all the aspects of our businesses to align that more with what the impact we're trying to create? Because every aspect of our business has an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And sort of leaving no stone unturned with every aspect of the organization's work.
Exactly. So if we are eliminating racism and empowering women, why would we not buy from diverse vendors?
Of course.
So it's every aspect of business.
Yeah.
And marketing communications is no different, but because it's always seen as an additive and an extra part that may or may not be necessary, it doesn't get that same level of focus and attention.
Exactly right.
But if we're trying to eliminate racism and empower women in my lifetime, we are going to use every tool available to us.
We cannot waste any time or any tools. I so agree. Oh, well, this is so great. Before we run out of time, I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions. So let's transition to audience Q&A. Audience, as a reminder, you can ask us questions in the questions box. I've already seen a couple come through that I will start to share with Dorri, and I'll try to answer myself as well if I can. But our first question comes from Bridget. And Bridget says, we service children in early childhood settings. How would you recommend having them provide input? Any thoughts on that?
Ask their parents.
Number one,
ask their parents. And again, I think it depends on what we talked about. What are the goals, right? Because I think children are, when I sit on the board of an early learning center, and those kids they just got to walk in the room and they get me. They don't have to do or say anything. But I do think strategically and smartly incorporating them into activities without, again, creating sort of that dog and pony show that kids can often bring to the table. Can be entertaining or a nuisance depending on what they're doing. But I just think, again, aligning that specific approach to what it is you're trying to accomplish and being smart and thoughtful about that, I think is important. And I'm sorry if that wasn't specific enough to help your specific situation, but I do think that, again, just being thoughtful around aligning those activities is the first step.
Yeah, I agree. I'll share just a kind of personal anecdote that's top of mind for me right now because I actually dealt with this a little bit yesterday. Not quite early childhood, but almost first through third graders. I was out on a story gathering mission yesterday for one of our foundation clients that we work with here at Prosper Strategies. And for their end of year fundraising, we are aiming to tell stories of the beneficiaries of the grantee organizations that the foundation funds, right? So kind of a couple layers removed. And one of the organizations that we're aiming to do some storytelling around is a literacy program for children first through third grade. The theme of the campaign that we are hoping to work toward, depending on the sorts of stories we get, again, not putting stories in people's mouths, is around the opportunity that these programs are creating in the lives of people who are a part of the programs. So yesterday I was sitting down with first through third graders, interviewing them, asking them questions, doing art projects with them so that conversations could emerge organically while we talked to them, but really trying to get to the heart of what opportunities are being created in their lives through these programs. You certainly can't ask a third grader or first through third grader that question in that direct of a manner and have it feel like something that would then elicit an authentic response for them, or that would be true to the way that they would interact with an adult like me, right? So we ask them a lot about what reading means to their lives, what their favorite books are, why they like to read or why maybe they don't, how they've improved as readers since they started in this program. And then we ask them a lot about their future, what they want to be when they grow up, how they feel about the role reading might play in their future, right? So we were kind of coming at it from a different perspective, a perspective that was age appropriate for these children. And the goal will be then, as we kind of shape what we got from those interviews into stories, to run the stories both by the parents of the children who these parents signed releases to have their kids participate in the process, to run by the parents, and to ask the parents to run the stories by the children and say, does this sound like your story? Because in one example, I asked the kid what they wanted to be when they grew up. The kid said, I don't know. I should have dropped the questioning there, and I kind of asked some leading questions that led the kid down this road of saying, maybe I want to be a toy designer, right? And then at the end of the interview, I said, so this is exciting. Maybe you're going to be a toy designer. And the kid said, well, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Our story needs to say, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but reading helps me explore all these different options, which is what we ultimately ended up with. If that is in fact accurate, I'd like that to be then confirmed by the parent and the child who were involved in the process, that feels true to their experience, and not put words in their mouths. But
yeah, and I'll offer one more thing. It made me think about this early learning center that I do work with. I think that our first thought is that the children can help us sort of engage the donors the most. And we had an opportunity to actually engage a teacher that her specific situation was that there was this child that had been disciplined and essentially kicked out of all these other schools, but it was she was the one who discovered that the child couldn't hear through one of their screenings that they do, and was able to get corrective action to be able to allow that child to participate in learning in a way that finally understood what that child was experiencing. And that story was so powerful because what it told was the quality of the care that we're providing and how we do what we do, because everyone knows that kids need to get educated. Right. But the true differentiated about our services was that we were really trying to make sure that child was receiving the highest quality education possible, including with these assessments.
Right.
And so I would argue that if there's opportunity to not just explore the experience of the child, which are always engaging for people, but also the systems that support that experience.
Yeah, that's great. Really good example there. Hopefully that's helpful. I think it's a hard thing. Someone else, we won't be able to get to this one, but someone else asked a similar question about animals. And I think there are some populations where this is easier or harder. But I think even in the animal case, if animals did have a voice, think about how they would want to be represented and don't exploit.
And I think that it's interesting because I think that, when we talk about sort of how we change the sector, the go-to component is show them the work.
Right.
But it also may be appropriate to have them have a greater understanding of the issue.
Yes.
And the issue may not always be specifically in the direct service. It could be the issue can be highlighted through the employees or other aspects of the business to make the point. And I just offer that because I think it has to matter in certain cases. But I think if we're all sort of have the cause, what is it then about our cause and our approach to the cause that we can highlight that really engages donors and supporters as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100% agree. Okay, I want to move on to another question here from Sabina. And Sabina says, I'm curious, with the information overload and prevalence of heartbreaking stories, how can you cut through the noise and have your positive stories heard? You talked a little bit about the story, but any more thoughts on that?
I think that it's the news cycle is so crazy too, relative to how much information people are getting about certain things at certain times. And I think that this is where we do have to be more creative and more consistent with our stories, so that we're not, so it's not just one that happened to show up, that we continue to think about messaging strategies and continue to put those stories out there. And as we talked about earlier, not just use sort of one channel either, right? But use multiple channels so that you're telling the same story, whether it's coming from your employee's perspective or your client perspective or whoever's perspective it's coming from, but just to continue to get those stories out there, because there is a lot of clutter. And I always say that, our biggest competition is just for mind share, period, regardless of if it's a cause or, to your point, any other things that are happening. But I think that it's important for us is just to continue to be consistent with that messaging and showing up in consistent ways, regardless of the platform or which angle we're coming into that story.
Yeah, repetition and consistency matters so much, especially in this extremely cluttered world that's getting more cluttered every day.
But I do say not participating is never an answer.
Right, exactly.
I do say that because I'm like, oh, no one's going to notice us anyway. Yeah, but if you're not out there, what is that? Is it Michael Jordan or whoever said you miss 100% stuff you don't take? If you're not there, they can't see you
if you're not there. Yep, exactly. Okay, Martha has a question about sort of the flip side of the situation that we've been talking about today. She says this is a story of top-down change with a visionary leader and Dorri who is leading the charge. So what advice do you have for people in the lower ranks of an organization who are the ones attempting to lead this change? What can they do?
I think any piece helps, right? And sort of start changing what's in your realm of control. And I think that a wholesale change, to your point, it's easier for me as a CEO to say, we're going to change this wholesale.
Right.
But I think that people have a scope of influence, and you do what you can where you can, and continue to be consistent with that as well. I know it gets really hard. But I think, sort of knowing who the folks are that may require change and having them see you be successful at a piece is a good way to get additional buy-in and continue to increase sort of that scope. Is one suggestion I would have.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think, Alyssa.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you have to have influence where you can. I think anytime you can share stories of other organizations that have made positive changes in these areas, and specifically it depends on what your leadership responds to, but if they respond to data, specifically if you can share data around positive results, both in mission and in things like fundraising revenue after making these sorts of changes, I think that can be powerful and compelling. But start with change wherever you can, even if it's in one piece of marketing collateral or in one program area. Aim to show impact, make the case that way with real life examples, and I think that will take you far. And then also share things like this. Share that conversations like these are happening in the sector. Put a bug in your CEO's ear for this webinar, manifesto, things like that. And hopefully over time, just like with any other kind of communications, if you have enough kind of touch points and repetition of conversation about this, it'll start to take some hold.
Absolutely. It made me think of that. I forgot who said it, but the quote is that it's not that people don't like change. They just don't like if it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think to your point of giving little examples of where it is working or how it can work for them to just take that fear of uncertainty away.
Yeah.
I think because they say people would change if they all knew it worked out okay.
Right. Exactly. So on that note, actually, that relates to the last question that we'll have time for today. Mark says, I would love to hear what sorts of increase in funding you may have seen following the rebrand of your storytelling versus the prior year when you utilized the old collateral or some other positive analytical change that you saw. So don't worry if you don't have exact numbers or figures.
No, because I won't.
Yeah.
But I think it's a process too, right? I don't think the day we switched over to our new material, all of a sudden the floodgates opened. I think that what's been consistent is that I'm very proud of the fact that, over the 6 years that we've grown from 11 million to now our operating budget is about 25 million, but that's because all of these things have been part of that change process. And so I do think that would not have happened, though, if we had not done the things that we did relative to, one, making marketing and communications a priority, and not just about the fundraising piece, but really how we engage with people became the focus. We actually changed our marketing development, all the names we changed to strategic engagement because the fundraising is the result of engaging people the way we need to and the way we want to. So I think it's all of those activities in total that allowed us to create this growth and this change. And some of that, of course, is from just some contracts, not just some contracts, but contracts, but it's also, we've been seeing a 30% year over year growth in our development outcomes, but it is because we changed how we engaged. And, can I relate it to a certain photograph? No, yeah. Not. But I think the process itself has yielded us different results.
Right. Well, and that's always how it is. There's always multiple changes happening at the same time. If your organization is evolving and quickly, and most are, you won't be able to unpack exactly what was caused by a change in the way you represent the people you work with, the images you use, the language you use from other things going on, but it should be part of a broader system and other change that's happening in other places. And hopefully you see at least a correlation in positive results. If you can't prove the causation, the correlation is usually there.
It definitely is. And, I know that ROI work is so tricky for people, but, but I do think that there is an ROI. That the question is how much, but I also think that there is an opportunity cost for not doing things differently as well.
I totally agree. Well, thank you, Dorri. This has been amazing. I wish we could keep talking for another hour, But we'll let you go. We'll let everyone else go. Thank you all so much for being here today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And as we wrap up, just want to share a couple of ways to stay engaged with Prosper and continue this conversation after today's webinar. So first off, many of you who have been on previous webinars have heard about this the last few months. We have a fledgling new Facebook group called the Nonprofit Marketing Collaborative that we hope will continue to grow and serve as a community for those of you who have been finding value in our webinar series, as well as just the wider world of nonprofit leaders and communicators. So you can find a link to that on your screen in the chat box, and we'll send that around in the follow-up email as well. And then we're also excited for our upcoming webinar in October, Mission Measurement and Marketing Measurement, with a firm called Mission Measurement. They'll be our special guest on that webinar. So you can register for that and all of our other upcoming webinars at prosper-strategies/webinars. And in the meantime, as always, hope you will continue building toward your own marketing revolution at your organizations, taking what you learned today and putting it to work. So please let me know if we can be of any help. My contact information is in the chat. It'll be on this next screen as we close out here, and you can find us online at prosper-strategies.com. Dorri, thank you again.
Thank
you,
appreciate
Alyssa.
it. This is so fabulous.
This has been lovely, and thank you everyone for being here. See you next time.